The government of India, Ministry of Civil Aviation, released the preliminary report regarding the accident involving Air India's Boeing 787 Dreamliner aircraft bearing the registration VT-ANB, which happened on June 12th of 2025, which is otherwise known as Air India Flight 171. So the preliminary report has been issued. It's been released. It's not the final report. It's probably going to take months, maybe even up to a year before we get the final report after they interview everybody. They dissect every single thing that they possibly can from the aircraft. They review all of the maintenance history, and they interview everyone involving the maintenance history, and on and on and on. It's going to take a very long time for them to get the final report all the way done. But in the meantime, I'll start with this clip here from ABC News Live. Let's give
John,
that a play.
A lot of this preliminary report is focused on that plane's fuel cutoff switches. First of all, explain to us what those are and what happens if one of those switches is turned off during takeoff or even mid-flight.
Well, they're the fuel and start ignition switches, and they're the heart and soul of the whole matter. When you fire the engine up, that's the last thing you do to put sparks in there and get the engine going. That's the last thing you do at the gate to shut it down. It's a lever lock switch. You have to pull it out and pull it down and put it back in, so you can't accidentally hit it and have it go off or on.
So you can't just bump into it. Just how difficult is it to turn these switches off on a big jumbo jet like that?
It just takes positive effort. It takes either a human hand or a simian hand, and there were only two humans in that cockpit. That's been confirmed now by our Air India. So only one of those hands reached down and turned off those two switches. We now know that. There's enough in this report, and it's devastating. There's enough in this report, Juju, to really tell us what we've got as the remaining question, and that is why.
And so why is the haunting question. How fast, if at all, can a plane recover from a...
Well, according to the report in the black box recording, one pilot turned to the other pilot and said, why did you cut the fuel off? And he said, I didn't. Or did you cut off the fuel? I think that's actually what was said, which I'll get to. One of the pilots turned to the other one and said, did you cut off the fuel cutoff switches? And he said, no, I didn't. And I'm not sure what else was said, if anything was said after that, but I mean, both pilots verbally said on the flight recorder that they did not cut off those switches. That doesn't prove that one of them did or didn't necessarily. It's just that they both verbally stated that they did not, or at least one confirmed that he didn't, even though the initial pilot asked the other one if or why he did. So
essentially
I
having
think
its
that's
fuel cut
worth
off
pointing out.
mid-flight.
It almost did. One of the engines was too far down in terms of winding down the RPM, and the airflow wasn't sufficient, so it couldn't get back up. But the other one, I believe it was number 2 on the right wing, when another hand reached down and turned this back on, the auto start began. It wound up. It almost had enough time, but not quite. They ran out of time and out of tube.
And then once these switches are turned off, even though they were turned back on, could anything else have been done to prevent the deadly outcome?
I doubt it. I really doubt it. At this point in time, the only thing would have been just a little bit of luck, or maybe waiting another couple of seconds to turn those engines off and a little faster turning them back on. But again, for any experienced pilot, there's no question in your mind what's going to happen if you turn these off. So the question in my mind is, was this some sort of mental aberration, or was this purposeful?
So in other words, was this, in your expert opinion, some sort of mass murder, or was it death by suicide? What might have been the cause?
Juju, we've seen this before, unfortunately, around the world. We had the China Southern accident. We've had
One
Egypt
in Germany
many years ago. There have been 2 other examples.
Flew into the mountain. I remember that one.
And this is very, very frightening to all of us in aviation because it's so difficult to control what
MH370 is also a possible contender.
We also had a pilot try to cut off 2 engines
suicide.
Because of an aberrant thought pattern. That was with Alaska Airlines some time ago, over a year ago. But the problem is this: we're just in a little box here, and that box says that somebody turned the engines off, and they would have known, since these are 2 qualified pilots, they would have known what the consequences were. So either there was a mental aberration or it was purposeful.
So regardless of why, does this report, in your mind, rule out mechanical failure or a design flaw?
Yeah, I think almost totally. Certainly when you talk about everything having been or circling around these two switches in terms of the cause of the accident. This is a feature that every jetliner has in one form or another. So a design flaw is really not something on the table. By the same token, the one brilliant thing about accident investigation is they leave no stone unturned. And the Indians have done a fine job here in this preliminary report.
Well, John Nance, as a pilot yourself, as an expert in aviation, we thank you so much for your insight.
Yep, that's the preliminary report, at least his opinion as to what the report revealed. So from Dr. Etiquette, he posted this from CBS Evening News. I can start my F-150 with my phone, and CBS wants us all to believe that the Air India crash happened because someone physically turned off the fuel supply? I mean, that's what ABC News seemed
We have
to
an update
suggest.
tonight on last month's Air India crash that killed all but one of the 242 people on board. A preliminary report provides new clues to how it happened, but raises questions as well. Robert Sumwalt is a former chairman of the National Transportation Safety Board and now a CBS News aviation safety analyst. He joins us now from Florida. So, Robert, what does this report say?
Maurice, one of the things I think it really points out is that this was not a problem with the airplane or the engines. Instead, the report indicates that somebody in the cockpit shut the fuel off to those engines.
Wow. So was this inadvertent or intentional? Does the report get into that?
I think that's going to be a really big question right there. Did somebody deliberately shut off the fuel, or was it somehow or another?
Is this dude getting paid by Boeing or what?
Inadvertently shut off the fuel.
What do y'all think?
This is a switch that shuts off the fuel in what instances normally?
Well, it couldn't have been the plane's fault.
Well,
oh, no.
normally you would
It
flip
has
those
to be the
switches
pilot's
up
fault,
to start
no
the
matter
engines,
what.
to introduce fuel into the engines, and at the completion of a flight, you shut off the engines by actually moving these to cut off.
And this happened early in the flight. So what
Well,
happens
that's
next
one way
here,
to make
Robert?
it happen.
What are we looking for?
Is that the only way to make it happen?
Maurice, this is a preliminary report put out by the Indian government. There's a lot of runway ahead of the...
Look, I also heard that there was something faulty with this fuel shutoff equipment, and Boeing had sent a notification to everyone who has these airplanes in their fleet, including India or Air India rather, and they apparently just disregarded it and they didn't fix it. So that's also another possibility that the equipment that goes into this switch, or these two switches that they're talking about with the fuel cutoff, it could have been a faulty device that was installed in the plane, and it was working fine up until this particular incident when they suddenly didn't work. So that's also another possibility that they're not mentioning in this
investigation. The investigators will continue to try and understand why these fuel switches were shut off just 3 seconds after liftoff.
Okay.
I mean, maybe there was information in the preliminary report stating that they did, in fact, get manually shut off and then turn back on. But from what I understand, they were switched back on at a minimum before the plane completely crashed. That's if they were indeed completely shut off. Now, this is just an example. This isn't obviously the image of them in the shut off position, but according to the preliminary report, apparently they were turned back on if they were even shut off in the first place. So, I mean, this is a clip. I guess I could play this just in case you didn't catch the plane crash itself. Let me see how I can do this. Oh, X is such a pain sometimes. Here we go. Yeah, this is the crash itself. Let me go back. There you go. Not the original. You can see it was taken on a screen. But yeah, there's that. So that was back on June 12th. Apparently, the fuel cutoff switches were flipped from run to cutoff just after takeoff, starving the engines of fuel, causing the Air India plane to crash. One pilot can be heard asking the other why he shut off the fuel, according to the Wall Street Journal. But in the report, it says, I did not. Let's see here. Preliminary report on Air India 171 crashes out. Both engines shut down mid-air soon after takeoff. Fuel cutoff switches transitioned from run to cutoff at 8:08 and 42 seconds UTC. And cockpit recording. One pilot asked the other pilot, why did he cut off? The other pilot replied, he didn't. So let me just see. RAT was deployed, and that's the little propeller doohickey at the bottom of the plane that provides emergency power and hydraulic power to the aircraft if it loses engine power. So engine 1 fuel cutoff transitioned from cutoff to run. Engine 1 was in recovery mode. Engine 2 could not enter recovery mode. Mayday, mayday, call it 8:09 and 5 seconds. And this is just the preliminary report, which the final one isn't going to come out for quite some time. The aircraft achieved the maximum recorded airspeed of 180 knots IAS at about 8:08 and 42 seconds UTC, and immediately thereafter, the Engine 1 and Engine 2 fuel cutoff switches transitioned from run to cutoff, position one after another with a time gap of 1 second. The engine N1 and N2 began to decrease from their takeoff values as the fuel supply to the engines was cut off. In the cockpit voice recording, one of the pilots is heard asking the other, why did he cut off? The other pilot responded that he did not do so. The CCTV footage obtained from the airport showed ram air turbine, or the RAT, the little propeller thing, getting deployed during the initial climb immediately after liftoff. No significant bird activity is observed in the vicinity of the flight path. The aircraft started to lose altitude before crossing the airport perimeter wall. And on the second page, as per the EAFR, the Engine 1 fuel cutoff switch transitioned from cutoff to run at about 8:08 and 52 seconds. The APU inlet door began opening at about 8:08 and 54, consistent with the APU auto start logic. Therefore, at 8:08 and 56, the Engine 2 fuel cutoff switch also transitions from cutoff to run. When fuel control switches are moved from cutoff to run while the aircraft is in flight, each engine's full authority dual engine control, or FADEC, automatically manages a relight and thrust recovery sequence of ignition and fuel introduction. The EGT was observed to be rising for both engines, indicating relight. Engine 1's core deceleration stopped, reversed, and started to progress to recovery. Engine 2 was able to relight but could not arrest core speed deceleration and reintroduced fuel repeatedly to increase core speed acceleration and recovery. The EAFR recording stopped at 8:09 and 11 seconds UTC. At about 8:09 and 05 seconds, one of the pilots transmitted Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. The ATCO inquired about the call sign. ATCO did not get any response but observed the aircraft crashing outside the airport boundary and activated the emergency response. So that's the highlighted portion of the preliminary report, and it does appear that it is only, I mean, I don't know if it's, no, it's 15 pages according to this, being that at the bottom it says it's the end of the report. So looks like there might be 15 pages in total. So Barkha Dut, Air India crash report, fuel was cut to engines immediately after takeoff. Per cockpit recorder, pilots said they did not cut the switch. Report does not explain why, despite known FAA advisory on potential problems with fuel switches locking properly on Boeing planes. And ironically, the report itself refers to this advisory, see below. More investigation has not been ordered against 787s. So let's see what he's talking about here. Let's see. The FAA issued Special Airworthiness Information Bulletin, SAIB number NM-18-33 on December 17th of 2018 regarding the potential disengagement of the fuel control switch locking feature. This SAIB was issued based on reports from operators of Model 737 airplanes that the fuel control switches were installed with the locking feature disengaged. The airworthiness concern was not considered an unsafe condition that would warrant airworthiness directive by the FAA. The fuel control switch design, including the locking feature, is similar on, what does this say? Freaking arrows, man. On various, is that? I'm going to say various Boeing airplane models, including part number 4TL837-3D, which is fitted in B787-8 aircraft, which I believe was the Air India, the Dreamliner. Aircraft VT-ANB. I think that was the number of the airplane itself, wasn't it? I believe it was. Yes, VT-ANB. That is the registration number of the aircraft that crashed in India, the Air India Flight 171. As per the information from Air India, the suggested inspections were not carried out as the SAIB was advisory and not mandatory. The scrutiny of maintenance records revealed that the throttle control module was replaced on VT-ANB in 2019 and in 2023. However, the reason for the replacement was not linked to the fuel control switch. There has been no defect reported pertaining to the fuel control switch since 2023 on VT-ANB. So, I mean, we're just going to have to wait for the final report on that. I mean, they could determine that it was faulty. I mean, it very well could have been, and that would perfectly explain why one pilot turned to the other and said, why'd you switch off the fuel? And he said, I didn't. And that would explain it, that the equipment was faulty, in which case, I mean, if that's the case, it sounds like Boeing is going to probably point to something like this and say, look, back in 2018, we told you that there could be something wrong with it, so it's your fault you didn't change it, even though it says in here that they did in 2019 and in 2023. So, I don't know. Sounds like Boeing's got certain lackeys on the mainstream news pointing the blame squarely at the pilots because those last couple of pundits that they had on those clips that I played, they conveniently left out the part where the other pilot said, I didn't activate that. And the first pilot turning to the other one asking him why he did. So the communication in the cockpit between the two pilots, they didn't touch that mechanism. They didn't touch those levers to cut off the fuel, at least according to the words that they were saying. Now, of course, the S word, the smid, could have possibly been a factor, I suppose. It's possible. Of course, they made the reference, the one in Germany that I remember, and he also mentioned another one. I can't remember. Oh, the one in China, and possibly MH370. I know that's always one of those possibilities that, the guy wanted to, make a legend out of himself or something, and that's why the plane, went all crazy like it did, and why we're most likely, I mean, I don't think we're ever going to find it, but whatever. Maybe we will. Who knows? But anyway, let me just move on to the next one. So the Jaipur Dialogues, Air India crash preliminary report. The preliminary AAIB report on the Air India flight AI-171 crash, Air India, Ahmedabad to London on June 12th of 2025. What are the key findings? Well, for one, the fuel control switch movement is suspected. Early black box analysis suggests that one or both engine fuel control switches were moved from run to cutoff shortly after takeoff, leading to a total loss of engine thrust. Second, there is currently no evidence of mechanical or design defects in the Boeing 787 airframe or GEnx-1B engines. Number 3, emergency power system activated. The ram air turbine RAT deployed during the final moments, indicating that the aircraft lost substantial electrical power consistent with engine shutdown. Number 4, investigators are still scrutinizing for any human errors. Number 5, black boxes recovered are intact. Both the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder were found intact and provided clear, usable data for analysis. What does this mean? The aircraft lost all thrust and electrical power within about 30 seconds of takeoff, with the RAT deployment confirming the scale of the failure. And the lack of mechanical faults shifts the investigative focus onto human factors, especially cockpit procedures involving fuel control switches. And the preliminary nature of the report means the exact causes are yet not finalized. It outlines the sequence of events and key aspects under investigation, but does not assign blame. So what comes next? The final report, which could take several months, will plunge deeper into crew decision-making, cockpit environment, maintenance history, training, and procedures. Its aim would be to provide robust safety recommendations and prevent recurrence. And I don't know if this is just one image, just the cover. Yeah, it just looks like it's just the preliminary report cover sheet. And I've got, I think, only one more. This one's a bit more extensive. This is from NDTV. Both engines shut down within seconds of takeoff. Air India crash probe report. So give this a watch if you want to listen along.
Ladies and gentlemen, in case you're just tuning in, only on NDTV, because no other channel is following this as closely as we are. We are now in a position and have been for the last half an hour or so we've been in a position to tell you what the preliminary report of AI171, the Air India aircraft, which crashed in Ahmedabad shortly after takeoff on the 12th of June. We are able to tell you what exactly the preliminary crash report says, and it is a real mystery. But what it does say is something that we need to look at very, very closely indeed. And what I will do is just run through the sequence of events as articulated in that crash report. And the key point is this. The aircraft, and I'm reading from the report at this stage, the aircraft achieved a maximum recorded airspeed of 180 knots, right? And it had taken off at that stage, as I understand it. And immediately thereafter, engine 1 and engine 2 fuel cutoff switches transitioned from the run to the cutoff position, one after another, in a time gap of 1 second. Now, as I go through all of the other details over here, it's important to remember this. The big mystery will be, why in the first place did the fuel cutoff switches transition to the cutoff position? If fuel is starved to the engines in a critical phase of its flight operations, then essentially there is very little chance of the aircraft being able to successfully fly away. The engine number 1 and engine number 2, as a result of these switches moving from the run to the cutoff position, right? And where are the switches? So just imagine this, viewers. If this is the pilot and this is the co-pilot, between them is the throttles. There are 2 throttles because there are 2 engines, and right behind them, shortly, right under, on their side, I should say, behind the throttles are 2 switches. We'll try and bring that up for you in a little while from now. And these switches need to be lifted like this and pushed forward and pushed back. If they are pushed forward, then that means that the engines are in the fuel switches are in an on position. If they are lifted and pushed back 2 notches from the on position, then they are switched off. Now, we don't know at this juncture whether the fuel switches physically moved from the on to the off position, or the fuel supply for other reasons, right, which were not associated or linked to the switches, cut off. But moving on, and I quote from the report, the engine number 1 and engine number 2 began to decrease from their takeoff values in other words, the takeoff speed, the takeoff thrust, as the fuel supply to the engines was cut off. Here's a critical bit. In the cockpit voice recording, one of the pilots is heard asking the other, why did he cut off? And the other pilot responds that he did not do so. Now, the aircraft starts to lose altitude before crossing the airport perimeter. There is a system called the RAT. That's it's a system, it's a small propeller which comes out in a situation like this when both the engines have stopped developing thrust, and it starts generating electricity or power just enough to ensure that there is hydraulic power available to the pilots. Hydraulic systems govern the use of many systems.
That's also important.
The RAT also develops enough power to ensure that basic electrical controls in the cockpit continue to function, right? So that was deployed. It deploys only when there is a grave emergency, such as an engine failure, I believe a dual engine failure. In this case, both the engines were starved of fuel. Now, the other key part of this, and this is equally important, is that as per the data which has been downloaded, the engine number 1's fuel cutoff switch then transitioned from the cutoff to the run position.
It began starting back up again.
One of the pilots put it back on.
It started its recovery phase.
Power unit, which is this tiny little engine in the back of the aircraft.
Whereas the other engine, second engine,
began operating.
It didn't start recovery fast enough before it crashed.
Because that APU, auxiliary power unit, is needed to initiate what's called an auto start logic. Now, all of this happens instantly, right? There's no time gap per se. You need that auto start logic, or that auto start function, because once you toggle the switch from the fuel switch from the off to the on position, the effort is to restart the engines. If you restart the engines, you will be able to resume. There would be thrust potentially available in the engines, and you should be able to fly away from that situation. When the fuel control switches, the report says, are moved from cutoff to run while the aircraft is in flight, each engine's full authority dual engine control, that's a digital system, automatically manages the relight and thrust recovery sequence of ignition and fuel introduction. This is critical. This indicates that, number one, the fuel control switches went from on to off, but subsequently, moments later, they were put back on, right? And when they were put back on, the engine started relighting. They were
Yeah, there they are right there.
to restart, right? The EGT was observed to be rising for both engines. Offhand, I don't remember what EGT refers to, but essentially the engine started spooling up. Engine 1 scored, deceleration stopped. One of the engines stopped decelerating and started to progress to recovery. While engine 2, remember the Dreamliner has only 2 engines, was able to relight it, did restart, but could not arrest the core speed deceleration and
Good, enough of the
reintroduce
breaking
fuel
news, man.
repeatedly, right? Automatically, you pump in more fuel, you hope it catches, and you hope that enough thrust is being generated. But that perhaps didn't happen. And I think a few seconds prior to that, one of the pilots transmitted, "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday." That's an emergency call. The air traffic controller inquired about the call sign. The air traffic controller didn't get any response, but observed the aircraft crashing outside the airport boundary and activated the emergency response. So that is the sequence of events that we know at this stage. In all of this, and from a very basic reading of what I have seen, it does appear to me that the focus of investigations will be on how the fuel switches in that Boeing 787 Dreamliner went from the on to the off position. Remember, one pilot asked the other, "Did you switch off the fuel switches?" To which he said, "No, I didn't," which begs the question, why exactly did this happen, right? That remains a mystery. It impacts Air India, it impacts Boeing, it potentially impacts General Electric, the manufacturer of the engine, as well. But it does remain at this juncture a key question. Had this aircraft had a little more altitude, it does appear that
Yep,
it
it
would
could
have
have
flown
recovered
out of
probably.
that situation.
Yep,
Another
that's
key
a
bit of
tragedy.
information, there was a lot of speculation on whether the flaps of the aircraft were configured properly, whether they were in the takeoff thrust position, position they were, right? So let's put that theory and toss it away. There was no incorrect configuration of the flaps of the aircraft. It was correctly
Yeah, that was
positioned to ensure the
a
aircraft
lot of conspiracies
could
swirling around
take
around
off
the flaps when
properly.
this first happened. I remember
So
that.
wasn't a factor. The
Everybody was
undercarriage
talking
was
about the
retracted.
flaps were not
Remember, if
extended.
there was an engine power, the undercarriage wouldn't have gone up. That causes problems in terms of it being unaerodynamic, the aircraft itself. But the fact of the matter is it didn't. But we have run through the basic sequence of events, which I've been able to understand from a speed read of that situation. That's what we know at this juncture, and we will try and give you more details as it actually does come in. But these
Which
are
we
key
probably won't
findings
get
from
till
the
the
Air
final
India
report.
crash report. It is a preliminary report. It's not the final report. The final report comes in perhaps a couple of months from now. Whether there is a press conference or not on this report, we will know later on.
Well, and if it concludes that it's pilot error, despite what they said in the flight recorder, you're going to have a lot of conspiracy theorists that are going to be speculating that, who's covering for Boeing or GE or whoever. And, like, how was the tone in his voice? Was he alarmed? Like, no, I didn't. I mean, that could play a factor also. I mean, how exactly did he sound? Like, I mean, when that was communicated, and I mean, there's gonna be a lot of people that are gonna be assuming, or if not fully believing, that there was something wrong with the mechanism of the fuel control switches. Like something's wrong with the hardware, and somehow they must have just popped out of their position, disengaged one way or another, and I mean, it seems to me, it just honestly just kind of seems unlikely, but I don't know anything about cockpit mechanics or anything like that. All I know is that there's two of these switches and you have to pull them out, completely out to move them. So it's like a two-step process. You can't just flip it up and flip it down. You have to actually like pop it out of its position and then move it. I think you said 2 clicks to get it to cut the fuel off or to return fuel back into the engines once they've been like returned back to its normal position. But I mean, either way, the conspiracies are going to go crazy either way. I mean, unless the only thing I could think of is that they do determine that these fuel control switches were indeed faulty, that they took them apart, they looked at it very closely, and honest to goodness, no foul play in the background, no like, hey, I'll pay you $5 million if you write it this way and not that way. None of that backyard bullshit or backdoor bullshit. I mean, if it's like truly by the book, 100% honest, and they actually show the device and they're like, look, this is what it's supposed to look like. And after we opened it up and took a look at it, look, you see how this like little control here and this little wire over there, and like just pointing out different aspects of it as to why it's not completely perfect. I mean, they might be able to point to something in the hardware that may have just malfunctioned, causing these fuel control switches to disengage when the pilots didn't even touch them. Because I don't know. I mean, just again, like the tone of the pilots could play a crucial role into whether or not if they may determine that it was pilot error, or maybe not. I mean, they might just put it on the pilots and just leave it at that. That would be the most convenient thing to do, surely. I mean, because we're talking massive companies. I mean, I'm sure Air India, it's not a small rinky-dink air company. It's an enormous company, and so is Boeing. So it would obviously be to their utmost highest advantage if they just deemed it to be pilot error, and that way the least amount of headaches. Boeing doesn't have to pay billions and billions of dollars. Air India really doesn't have to either. They could just put all the blame on the pilots. Of course, Air India is going to have to compensate in some way, shape, or form because they're the ones that hired these pilots. I mean, unless they were contracted from somebody else. But I mean, the liability is going to be a lot more minimal, I would say, if they just point the finger at the pilots, and it would just be a lot less of a headache for everybody if they just said, yeah, it is the pilot's fault. That's it. Just the pilot's fault. Even if they looked at it and determined that these fuel control switches were indeed faulty, because apparently Boeing did send out those notifications back in 2018, supposedly, that these fuel control switches can be faulty, or they've found some sort of a faulty mechanism in them, or at least in one of them, that warranted them, reaching out to all these airline companies and notifying them that, hey, you might want to get these switched out, which it sounds like Air India obliged with this particular aircraft. They changed this exact box. They changed this out in 2019 and in 2023. So they might have actually installed this device, which is, post defect, and it might just be functioning perfectly well. And it truly was the pilot's fault. It very well could have been. So I don't know. I mean, we kind of live in we live in the conspiracy era where there's just always something else going on in the background that some of us are not being told, and we're not going to be convinced otherwise. Boeing, it's completely Boeing's fault no matter what. I mean, you're definitely going to have a lot of people assuming that. I mean, just pointing to the other plane crashes that they were found liable for in recent history. I mean, you could get some people that just point to those two instances and say, yeah, they're absolutely responsible for this. Why wouldn't they be? It's their plane. But, I mean, who knows? I don't know. We'll just have to see when the final report comes out.
While there have been a couple of leaks saying that the focus of the probe is on the position of the fuel control switches, and that is correct, the leaks didn't suggest at all that, in fact, number one, the pilots attempted to relight, okay? And the engines did successfully relight, but there wasn't enough altitude. The aircraft went down and mushed onto the ground. This is an incredible tragedy, and questions do need to be asked of Air India.
No fuel contamination.
About their maintenance practices.
That was another theory
there is
when this first happened.
Raises question marks on whether they had done proper maintenance.
See, what was the reason why that they're mentioning that was because the lone survivor from the plane crash, he apparently said that he heard a loud bang right before the crash happened, which could have been consistent with fuel contamination, water getting in, mixed in with the fuel, which would have been the people that were supplying fuel to the aircraft. They could have been at fault in some way or another introducing fuel or water into the fuel tanks, which the water would have evaporated, and the hydrogen, oxygen molecules, one way or another, would have caused a minor explosion inside the fuel tanks, would have been consistent with a bang prior to the plane crashing, which that's not what ended up happening. Like, that's not what they're looking at this point. I'm sure they're still going to probably keep that in consideration, maybe, but maybe they've already investigated enough of the plane wreckage to determine that, yeah, there was nothing wrong with the fuel. Because, I mean, at least what they said in this breaking news, that there was nothing wrong with the fuel. In other words, there was no water that was mixed in with the fuel that would cause any kind of combustion to happen inside the fuel
to
tank.
the fuel switch off, to the fuel switches, whether there was any issue with the throttle assembly of the aircraft, or whether, in fact, this points to a larger systemic issue with Boeing 787 Dreamliners, of which there are more than 1,000 across carriers all over the world. And what about the General Electric engines? The Gen X engines, state of the art, absolutely. They are a key part of all of this. Are there any electrical systems which could be associated with the functioning of the engines, which need to be looked at very, very carefully indeed? So that's the breaking
That's
news
possible too.
that we have at this stage. We will continue to track this very, very closely throughout the morning. But there is a lot of information here, a lot to process at this juncture. But I think we've run through, and we are the only channel sort of pursuing this, because it concerns the lives of the relatives, the friends of those 260 people who lost their lives. Aditi, I see you now.
Yes.
I think I'm
All
losing
right.
my voice sooner than later. It's over to you.
All right. So, yeah, I mean, for it to be an engine malfunction, I mean, I personally would see that to be somewhat unlikely, because both engines cut off, and it appears that they both cut off at the exact same time. So it doesn't really seem that that's probably going to be in any way likely, even though I guess it may not be completely impossible, because from my understanding is that these engines, they operate independently of one another, just in case one of them ends up, blowing out midair. That way the other one can continue running to keep the plane aloft long enough for an emergency landing, at least. But I don't know. Like he said, we're just going to have to see what happens. And I mean, that's basically all I got. That's pretty much what everybody has at this point. So, I mean, it seems like the fingers are starting to point toward the pilots, even though they adamantly said on the flight recorder that they did not activate those switches. So I guess we'll just have to see what happens as the months roll on, and eventually we'll see the final report. Not sure when. I mean, I'll keep an eye on it. Once they release the final report, I'm sure I'll do a video on it. But anyway, that's all I got for now. Thanks a lot for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you later.